Hi, and welcome to this Renew Review. My name is John Whitaker, and in addition to doing some writing and book reviews like this for Renew, I'm also the creator of what's known as the Listener's Commentary on the New Testament. It's a free audio commentary that you can find on Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. It has its own app that you can download from the App Store, and it just provides clear, down-to-earth teaching straight through books of the New Testament. In this Renew Review, we are going to be looking at a book by Austin Ficher entitled Young, Restless, and No Longer Reformed. And the title clearly plays off of the well-known book by the almost opposite title, Young, Restless, and Reformed. And in this book, Ficher tells his own story of his journey into Calvinism as well as his journey out of Calvinism. And because it's written as a story, the book actually moves fairly quickly. It's engaging to read. It's definitely not dry, boring theology, and it's only 109 pages long, so it's not a long book. And what that means is it's really a quick read that unveils several of the major problems with Calvinism as a theological system, and it offers really a better alternative. In fact, Ficher writes, "I believe we best say yes to God's glory and sovereignty by saying no to Calvinism." Now, before we proceed any further with this review, let me just say right up front that I have plenty of friends who are Calvinists. I know lots of Calvinists who love God, who love the church, and who are faithful followers of Jesus. And that's not the point of this review. The point of this review is to engage with this particular book that wrestles with Calvinism as a theological system. And as a system like that, I think Calvinism fails both biblically and pastorally. And Austin Ficher found the exact same thing. So let me just give you a brief summary of the book. The story for Ficher begins in chapters 1 and 2 of this book, where Ficher describes his journey into Calvinism during his late teen years. And he was really hungering for more from his faith when his youth pastor introduced him to Desiring God by John Piper and suggested that they walk through this book together. And as he read through that book, he began being introduced to the ideas of Calvinism. And he began reading and studying other Calvinist authors as well. And he soon concluded that Calvinism must be true, even though he had some maybe early difficulties with it. And the reason he concluded it must be true is, in his words, he said, "I didn't feel as though the Bible left me any other option." And so the Calvinist vision of God as one who's determined to display his own glory and one who ordains all things that come to be became the organizing center of Ficher's theology and life. Well, after those two chapters telling that bit of the story, chapters 3 and 4 then pick up with really the journey into sort of a crisis of faith that became the catalyst for him abandoning Calvinism. And that crisis of faith revolved around the doctrine of hell. You see, consistent Calvinism entails that God created most people to be damned to hell. In fact, he ordained that, and he did so for his own glory. Well, taking a long, hard look at that doctrine really, in the words of Ficher, made God and the Bible impossible for him. And before long, he no longer knew exactly what he believed. He just knew that if he was going to believe in the God of the Bible, he could no longer be a Calvinist. So the rest of the book after chapter 4 then invites us to journey along with Ficher as he rebuilds his theology. And as he tells the story, the starting point for that was really beginning to realize that we have to experience and come to know God as he's revealed to us in the person of Jesus. And so whoever God is, he must be like Jesus as Jesus is revealed in the scriptures. In the words again of Ficher, taken straight from Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, if we're going to know God, we have to come to know the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. So building off of that foundation, Ficher wrestled with, well, what is the exact essence of God's glory? And what really does the nature of God's sovereignty mean as it relates to human beings who, for all appearances, seem to have free will? He even addresses some of the difficulties within Calvinism, as well as some of the difficulties within non-Calvinism, which he describes as monsters in the basement of our theology. And he says every theological system has such monsters in their basement. It's just that he's way more willing, both biblically and pastorally, to live with some of the implications of non-Calvinism than he was with a God who creates and damns most people to hell. The final 3 chapters of the book briefly address just a few more topics. One is the nature of theological knowledge and the certainty with which we can hold that knowledge. Chapter 10 then wrestles with that the difference that our theology makes with regard to the gospel and discipleship. And then finally, in chapter 11, he explores Romans chapter 9 and does it really teach the Calvinist version of predestination. Now, why this book? Why this review? Where does it fit into your ministry, and how can it serve you? The fact is we live in a day and age where the ease of access to all sorts of ideas is right at our fingertips, right? YouTubes, podcasts, blogs. It's literally just a click of a button away, and we can explore all sorts of different ideas. And so when it comes to theology, that means that more people are being exposed to a wider variety of ideas than ever before. And so there's a lot more theological cross-pollination than there used to be. And one of those theological systems whose influence is spread as a result of that theological cross-pollination is Calvinism. So if your church is from a more Arminian background or some other non-Calvinistic background, just don't be surprised if you discover that there are members of your church, even influential members, even members who maybe are leading in various ministries, that are sort of being influenced by or even discipled into a Calvinist understanding of Scripture and of God. And that's where I think this book can be most helpful. This book, Young, Restless, No Longer Reformed, definitely won't provide you with a full, thoroughgoing understanding of Calvinism itself. No one's going to learn the ins and outs of tulip through reading this particular book. For that, you're going to have to turn elsewhere. In fact, I've written a short free ebook on Renew's website, renew.org, that walks through tulip, explains each of the parts of that acrostic, and then points out maybe some shortcomings and flaws with each. So you can check that out if you want more. Not only that, Bobby Harrington and I have also put together a list of what we see as some helpful books to help you understand Calvinism and some of its shortcomings. This book won't do all of that for you. What this book will do is this. It's perfect to be used in a conversation with somebody who's already familiar with Calvinist theology, who maybe is considering adopting Calvinism, or maybe they have adopted some Calvinist ideas and they're a part of your congregation, and you want to help them think more deeply and biblically and Christ-centeredly about the nature of their theology. I think that's where this book comes in. It provides a more Christ-centered, glorious vision of God than Calvinism offers. And because of its nature as a personal book, and because it's short, it's more winsome than like a heavy dogmatic book of theology. And so it could be useful in sitting down with someone and just thinking through, what does Calvinism entail? What are some of the necessary implications of that belief system? So let me just offer a few of the key ideas that this particular book will at least help you think through. First, Calvinism teaches that God ordains everything that happens in the world. That's just part and parcel of Calvinist theology. It's sort of like the backstory for all of Calvinist belief. And one of the implications of that is that even evil is ultimately ordained by God in consistent Calvinism. Not only that, it also means that God ordains who's saved and who's not saved, who would be damned, and he does so in order to display his glory. And so Ficher, as he wrestled with that implication, he began to realize that if God created people and ordained their damnation, then in what sense can God be good and loving? The impact on him was this. This is the way he describes it on page 34. He says, for him, the lights went out. And he says, I was left sitting in the dark in an absurd universe with an enigmatic deity of naked power. So Ficher wrestles with that and helps us realize, okay, maybe we need to think more clearly about who God is rather than the way Calvinism describes it. Second, Ficher highlights the centrality of Jesus to our understanding of God. He writes that you either find God on Jesus' terms or you find something that isn't God. Jesus' character, as revealed in the scriptures, sets the standard for God's character. So rather than locating God's glory in his supremacy and his power, the glory of God that we meet in Jesus is the glory of self-sacrificial, self-giving love. In other words, God pursues his glory by pouring out himself in love. And so Ficher writes, when God opens his heart to us and we get a glimpse of what makes God's heart beat, namely Jesus Christ and him crucified, we see a desire to love at all costs, not glorify himself at all costs. And then a third key idea, God is the one who gets to define what his sovereignty means. And what we learn when we look at God and we look at Jesus and we look at the whole story of the Bible is that God is so incredibly powerful and sovereign that he can actually make room for human free will and still achieve his purposes. Again, Ficher puts it like this. Apparently, God's sovereignty makes room for human freedom so that God and humans can have a personal and not merely casual relationship. Now, there's other ideas in the book, but those are three ideas that are at the heart of the story that Ficher tells about his own journey into and out of Calvinism. Before we leave this review, let me offer just one critique. In chapter 9, as I mentioned above, Ficher offers his perspective on certainty with regard to theological knowledge. And I appreciate his emphasis on the need for humility. Theology done right should lead to humility and worship. And if it doesn't, we're doing something wrong. Deeply appreciate that by Ficher. Nevertheless, some of the ways Ficher expresses his thoughts in that chapter was just a little too weak for my taste. It seems like some of the things Ficher said made it sound as if he was saying it's all so personal as to be purely subjective. I'm not so sure that's what he meant to communicate, but that's what came across, at least to me. And if that is what he intended, I think his understanding of how we know things and what we can know could use some improvement. Nevertheless, despite that one critique, I think Young, Restless, and No Longer Reformed is a helpful tool for guiding people away from Calvinism and into a more Christ-centered reading of Scripture, a more faithful reading of Scripture. And I think this matters because the God of Calvinism is just not nearly as good or as great as the God that we meet in the person of Jesus.